Morning, everybody. God bless you. And Charlie did call me this morning, and I just happened to have something to say. So it's a good day. Several weeks ago, I had the opportunity to share the Word of God in our fellowship, and we read 1 Corinthians chapter 12 that day. And as a part of that, of course, we read 1 Corinthians 12, verses 4 through 7, and that's where we want to start this morning. In 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verses that are familiar to us. Verse 4, now there are diversities of gifts, but the same Spirit, and there are differences of administrations, but the same Lord. And there are diversities of operations, but it is the same God which worketh all in all. One of the things we talked about on that morning was that in the body of Christ, there's such a wide diversity of people. Everybody has different gifts. Everybody has different capabilities and capacities. We have different ways of serving. I don't serve in the same way, for instance, that Jeff Wendling would. We have different effects that are produced because of our different capabilities and abilities, because of the different ways we serve. We all produce different effects. But verse 7, the manifestation of the Spirit is given to every man to profit withal. One of the things I mentioned that day was that whatever your gifts, whatever your way of serving, whatever effects are produced by the gifts in the serving, that's all brought to full fruition when you operate the manifestations of the Spirit in your life. And that's what I want to talk about this morning and give you some biblical examples of what I meant by that. The title of this teaching, if you ever go to the website to see it, is To Profit Withal Biblical Examples. And the first biblical example we're going to start with is a man by the name of Joseph. So if you'll go to Genesis chapter 37, we aren't going to take the time this morning. We don't have the time this morning to read the entire record of Joseph and discuss everything that could be discussed. But I want to show you some things about Joseph so you can see how the manifestations of the Spirit in his life brought to full fruition his abilities and capacities. So in Genesis 37, verse 2, these are the generations of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was feeding the flock with his brethren. And the lad was with the sons of Bilhah, with the sons of Zilpah, and his father's wives. And Joseph brought unto his father their evil report. Now Israel loved Joseph more than all his children, because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a coat of many colors. And when his brethren saw that their father loved him more than all his brethren, they hated him and could not speak peaceably unto him. They needed to have Charlie's forgiveness class is what they needed. But you can see this record starts, he's just a teenager. In verse 27, we're going to skip over some things. We're just going to read here how Joseph ended up getting to Egypt. In verse 27, his brother said, "Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him." They had intended, of course, to kill Joseph, but then Reuben stepped in and got him to stop that, and they threw him in a pit. And then now they decide, hey, here's a way we can make a little money off of this whole transaction, so let's sell him to the Ishmaelites. For he's our brother in our flesh, we're not going to do anything to him. And his brethren were content. And they passed by Midianites, merchantmen, and they drew and lifted up Joseph out of the pit and sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver, and they brought Joseph into Egypt. So that's how he got to Egypt. And then in verse 36, we see these Midianites, when they get there, they sold him into Egypt unto Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh's and a captain of the guard. So Joseph has now gotten into Egypt, and he's been sold as a slave, a servant, to Potiphar. to work in Potiphar's house. The thing I want you to realize is that Joseph is not just an illiterate shepherd who happened to be wandering around. He had, and we're going to see this, he had abilities, he had capacities, he had some strengths, and all of those helped bring him into a position of respect and honor and responsibility. Chapter 39, we're going to skip over, of course, chapter 38. We read that when we were talking about 3 women in Scripture. Verse 1, Joseph was brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, the Egyptian, bought him of the hands of the Ishmaelites, which had brought him down thither. And the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a prosperous man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all he did to prosper in his hand. And Joseph found grace in his sight, and he served him, and he made him overseer over his house, and all that he had he put into his hand. And it came to pass from the time that he made him overseer in his house and over all that he had, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake, and the blessing of the Lord was upon all that he had in the house and in the field. And he left all that he had in Joseph's hand, and he knew not aught that he had save the bread which he had to eat. That's the only thing he had to worry about, is what are we having for dinner? And Joseph took care of everything, and he was a goodly person and well-favored. So we can see Potiphar, notice, Joseph gets sold as a young man into this slavery position, and Potiphar sees his abilities, sees his capacities. And it's the Lord is helping, working in Joseph as well to bring those capacities to full fruition. He must have had business sense. He must have had ability with people because he was over all the other people in the house. He must have had some discretion and just all sorts of capacities and abilities. But they're brought to full fruition, of course, because of the Spirit of God. In verse 20, some things happened in Potiphar's house. Joseph gets unduly accused of some actions that he did not take. It's unfair, completely unfair. And yet he ends up in prison. Verse 20, Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, a place where the king's prisoners were bound, and he was there in the prison. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners that were in the prison. And whatsoever they did there, he was the doer of it. The keeper of the prison looked not to anything that was under his hand, because the Lord was with him, with Joseph, and that which he did, the Lord made it to prosper. So Joseph gets thrown into prison. He gets thrown into this jail, and the warden, you first get there, he's a prisoner. They don't know if they can trust him. They don't know. He's being thrown into jail. You have to imagine that. But again, he's not just an illiterate shepherd. His abilities, the capacities he had, his decision-making, his discretion, all of that comes to the fore because of the Spirit of God in him. And the warden, the keeper of the prison, sees this, and he elevates Joseph to a position of authority. And this stuff didn't just happen overnight. He didn't get into prison, and get his orange jumpsuit or whatever they wore in the prison in those days, and immediately get put into this position of responsibility. It took time. The warden had to see it, just like Potiphar had to observe and see Joseph working. Well, a couple other guys get thrown into prison, Butler and the baker, and they have dreams, and the record, you have to read it. And Joseph helps them with interpreting their dreams, gives God all the glory through this whole thing. Remember, he gives God the glory. He helps them with their dreams and just says, look, when you get out to the butler, when you get out, remember me, don't forget me. And of course, Butler forgets him. So in chapter 41, Another guy ends up having a dream, and it's a guy named Pharaoh. In verse 9, and nobody can tell Pharaoh what his dream meant. He's completely confused. All the wise men are completely confused. Nobody knows what's going on. In verse 9, then spake the chief butler unto Pharaoh, saying, I do remember my faults this day. Pharaoh was wroth with his servants and put me in ward, the ward of the captain of the guard's house, both me and the chief baker. We dreamed a dream. One night, we dreamed each man according to the interpretation of his dream. And there was with us a young man, a Hebrew servant of the captain of the guard, and we told him, and he interpreted to us our dreams. And to each man according to his dream did he interpret it, and it came to pass, as he interpreted to us, so it was. Me he restored into mine office, and him he hanged. Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they brought him hastily out of the dungeon. And he shaved himself and changed his raiment, came into Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, I have dreamed a dream, and there is none that can interpret it. And I've heard say of thee that thou canst understand a dream to interpret it. And Joseph answered Pharaoh and said, it's not in me. God shall give Pharaoh the answer of peace. So again, he's giving God the glory. But you can see he's working within himself. It's much like what Terry just shared, actually. We go to work, you have your abilities, God working in you, and people notice, and you get promoted. In verse 37, you know the record. Pharaoh tells him the dream. He interprets the dream, tells him exactly what's going to happen. Now Pharaoh knows what the next 14 years are going to bring, economically for Egypt, which who wouldn't want to know that if you're running a country? What are the next 14 years going to bring? Verse 37, the thing was good in the eyes of Pharaoh and in the eyes of all his servants. And Pharaoh said unto his servants, can we find such a one as this is, a man in whom the Spirit of God is? And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, for as much as God hath showed thee all this, there is none so discreet and wise as thou art. Thou shalt be over my house, and according unto thy word shall all my people be ruled. Only in the throne will I be greater than thou. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, see, I have set thee over all the land of Egypt. And he took off his ring. Pharaoh took his ring off his hand. He put it on Joseph's hand, arrayed him in vestures of fine linen, got rid of the orange jumpsuit, I guess, and put a gold chain around his neck. He made him to ride in the second chariot which he had. And they cried before him, bow the knee. And he made him ruler over all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without thee shall no man lift up his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. And he called Joseph's name, that word. I think they just called Joseph Z for a nickname. Hey, Z. And he gave him to wife Asnereth, the daughter of Potiphar, the priest of On. And Joseph went out over all the land of Egypt. And he was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. And he went out from the presence of Pharaoh and throughout all the land of Egypt. So the overview that we've just done now covers 13 years. This wasn't just something that happened overnight. Joseph had time to demonstrate his abilities. People noticed his abilities. God was working in him. Now, business sense, administrative abilities, being able to work with people like that, those are not manifestations of the Spirit. But the manifestations of the Spirit allowed his capacities and abilities to be brought to full fruition. It profited not only all the people there, but it profited Joseph too. That's what I mean, to profit with all. Biblical examples. There's Joseph. It wasn't just his administrative abilities. It was all the administrative and abilities and business sense and his ability to work with a staff and people and give all of that, plus the Spirit of God. It brought him to a position of great prominence. Our next example, is in the book of Exodus. So Genesis and Exodus. And this is the gentleman by the name of Bezalel. Chapter 31 of Exodus. And verse 1. And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, See, I have called by name Bezalel, the son of Uri, the son of Hur, of the tribe of Judah. And I have filled him with the Spirit of God in wisdom and in understanding and in knowledge and in all manner of workmanship, to devise cunning works, to work in gold and in silver and in brass and in cutting of stones, to set them, and in carving of timber, to work all manner of workmanship. And I, behold, I have given with him Aholiab, the son of Ahisamach of the tribe of Dan, and in the hearts of all that are wise-hearted, I have put wisdom, that they may make all that I have commanded thee. See, God had told Moses what he wanted made and how he wanted it made, the tabernacle, the ark, all that stuff. And now he's got this gentleman Bezalel, and then his other gentleman, Aholiab. God has put spirit in them so that they can do this work. Now, to be a craftsman in metal work, to be a metal worker like this, to be a craftsman in the cutting of gemstones and setting of gemstones in a metal setting, to be a craftsman in wood cutting and timber carving, to be a master craftsman and all of that stuff, those are not manifestations of the Spirit. They are not manifestations of the Spirit. But for this work to be done in the way that God wanted it done, to have the effect he wanted it to have on his people, they needed to have spirit too. Now, they have a little digression with the children of Israel involving Moses' brother Aaron and a golden calf. So it takes a little bit of time. They have to get some things straightened out. When we get to chapter 35 in Exodus, they're finally back on track. They've taken care of the whole golden calf incident and had to replace the tablets that Moses broke. There was just a little digression. But in verse 30 of chapter 35, and Moses said unto the children of Israel, See, the Lord hath called by name Bezalel, the son of Uri, the son of Hur, the tribe of Judah. Now that's an interesting point. It was the Lord that called him. God is the one who, remember in Corinthians we read, God's placed every member in the body as it has pleased him. It wasn't Moses that decided that this is how it should be. It was God that decided how this should be. God has called this guy, verse 31, he hath filled him with the Spirit of God in wisdom and in understanding and in knowledge and in all manner of workmanship, to devise curious works, to work in gold and in silver and in brass and in the cutting of stones, to set them, and in the carving of wood, to make any manner of cunning work. And he hath put in his heart that he may teach, both he and Aholiab, the son of Ahisamach of the tribe of Dan. Then he hath filled with wisdom of heart to work all manner of work, of the engraver, of the cunning workman, of the embroiderer in blue and purple, and scarlet and fine linen, of the weaver, even of them that do any work, and of those that devise cunning work. Okay? This was their version of way builders in a sense. But all of those activities, those are not manifestations of the Spirit. But for it to be done in the way that God wanted it to be done, they needed to have the Spirit and the manifestations to bring those abilities to full fruition. Chapter 36, verse 1. Then wrought Bezalel and Aholiab and every wise-hearted man, in whom the Lord put wisdom and understanding, to know how to work all manner of work for the service of the sanctuary, according to all that the Lord had commanded. And Moses called Bezalel and Aholiab and every wise-hearted man, in whose heart the Lord had put wisdom, even every one whose heart stirred him up to come unto the work to do it. And they received of Moses all the offering which the children of Israel had brought for the work and the service of the sanctuary to make it withal. And they brought yet unto him free offerings every morning. And all the wise men that wrought all the work of the sanctuary came every man from his work which they made. And they spake unto Moses, saying, the people bring much more than enough for the service of the work which the Lord commanded to make. And Moses gave commandment, and they caused it to be proclaimed throughout the camp, saying, let neither man nor woman make any more work for the offering of the sanctuary. So the people were restrained from bringing, for the stuff they had was sufficient for all the work to make it, and too much. That just shows you how honest Bezalel and Aholiab were. They had all this stuff coming in. Remember, the children of Israel had gathered all the gold and silver out of Egypt. The Egyptians just loaded them down to get rid of them. And they had all this stuff. Most workmen will say, yeah, keep it coming in, keep it coming in. Maybe we need to take a little off the top. But they were honest, they were discreet. You can see their capacities and their capabilities. And it was the Spirit of God working in them that allowed those abilities to come to full fruition. You know, Jeff Wendling here. Jeff was in the car business. He helped believers get cars. And if there's any business you ever need someone with the Spirit of God and the love of God in, it would be the car business. You know, Jeff could tell us stories, I'm sure, of how God worked in him and showed him different things when he was trying to help people that made it become the best blessing, not only for the people he was selling the car to or getting the car for, but also for him and his business. Deb Quillen is a florist. Now, being a florist, a floral designer, is not a manifestation of the Spirit, but the flowers she makes for people at significant moments in their lives have an impact on them. And she could tell you stories how God has worked in her to show her how to do things to make it the best blessing for everybody. All of us have stories like that about our lives, where the things we do are that. And maybe it's not a manifestation of the Spirit, but it's God working in us while we do those things that allow the impact that we have on people to be the greatest that it could be. One more example, and that is, we're going to go to 1 Samuel, a man by the name of David. Now, we're not going to read everything in the Bible about David. You would probably understand that. David was many things when you read about his life. He was a shepherd. He was a musician. He was a songwriter. He was a king. He had a lot of different roles that he played. But one of the roles he played, he was a man of war. He was skilled in the martial arts. He was skilled in military strategy. And the martial arts and military strategy, those are not manifestations of the Spirit. It's important to realize that those are not manifestations of the Spirit, but the manifestations of the Spirit in David, at work in David's life, evidenced in David's life, allowed him to bring those abilities to full fruition. In chapter 17 of 1 Samuel, in verse 26, you're familiar with this record. We're not going to read the entire record, just some highlights. David confronting an individual by the name of Goliath. Verse 26, and David spake to the men that stood by him, saying, what shall be done to the man that killeth this Philistine, and taketh away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God? In verse 31, when the words were heard which David spake, they rehearsed them before Saul. Saul sent for him. And David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him, for thy servant will go out and fight with this Philistine. And Saul said unto David, thou art not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for thou art but a youth, and he a man of war from his youth. And David said unto Saul, thy servant kept his father's sheep. And there came a lion and a bear, and took a lamb out of the flock. And I went out after him, and smote him, and delivered it out of his mouth. When he arose against me, I caught him by his beard, and smote him, and slew him. Thy servant slew both the lion and the bear. And this uncircumcised Philistine shall be as one of them, seeing he hath defied the armies of the living God. Well, you know how the record goes. He picks up, he gets, they first give him Saul's armor, and he says, I can't use this. I haven't proved it. And he gets his sling and 5 smooth stones. And in verse 49, David put his hand in his bag, took thence a stone, and slang it, and smote the Philistine in his forehead, that the stone sunk into his forehead, and he fell upon his face to the earth. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone, and he smote the Philistine and slew him. But there was no sword in the hand of David. So that wasn't the first time he'd ever used his sling. You have to understand that. I mean, he was proficient with that sling. It wasn't the first time but we would all agree that this wasn't just a lucky shot. He just a lucky stone that he happened to land. In chapter 18, verse 14, David behaved himself wisely in all his ways, and the Lord was with him. Wherefore, when Saul saw that he behaved himself very wisely, he was afraid of him. But all Israel and Judah loved David because he went out and came in before them. David was just open with these people, and he was loved by everybody. But Saul was afraid. And Saul decides to make David his son-in-law. And they tell David that, the Saul king, you're going to be married to his daughter. And I can't do that. I can't do that. I don't have enough for a dowry to get into something like that. And Saul said in verse 25, thus shall you say to David, the king desires not any dowry, but 100 foreskins of the Philistines, to be avenged of the king's enemies. But Saul thought to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines. See, that was Saul's plan. He asked for the foreskins of the Philistines because he thought 100 guys, they're going to kill David. They'll take David out. And when his servants told David these words in verse 26, it pleased David well to be the king's son-in-law. And the days were not expired, wherefore David arose and went, he and his men. They slew of the Philistines 200 men. And David brought their foreskins, and they gave them in full tale to the king, that he might be the king's son-in-law. Now, David didn't go out with 200 guys, but they took out 200 of the Philistines and got their 200 foreskins. So we know he's not squeamish. He's capable with military arts. He's capable with the martial arts. In chapter 23, we see David developing some military strategy. Verse 1, they told David, saying, behold, the Philistines fight against Keilah, and they robbed the threshing floors. Therefore David inquired of the Lord, saying, shall I go and smite the Philistines? And the Lord said unto David, go and smite the Philistines, and save Keilah. And David's men said unto him, behold, we're afraid here in Judah. How much more then if we go to Keilah against the armies of the Philistines? David's men weren't quite on board with this plan. But David inquired of the Lord yet again, and the Lord answered him and said, arise, go to Keilah, for I will deliver the Philistines into thine hand. So David and his men went down to Keilah and fought with the Philistines and brought away their cattle and smote them with a great slaughter. So David saved the inhabitants of Keilah. He was strong with military strategy. He was strong with his military abilities. He was developed in the martial arts. David, he was many things, but to be proficient in martial arts and military strategy is not a manifestation of the Spirit. those in and of themselves are not manifestations of the Spirit. But we can see that it was the Spirit of God in David working with those in the manifestations that allowed those abilities to cause him to shine above everybody. The abilities were not manifestations of the Spirit, but the Spirit of God and the manifestations allowed those abilities to really come to the fore. We're going to go to 2 Samuel chapter 22. Read some verses that are familiar to you, but I think putting them into the context that we're putting them in here this morning will be kind of beneficial. In chapter 22, in verse 1, and David spake unto the Lord the words of this song in the day that the Lord had delivered him out of the hand of all his enemies and out of the hand of Saul. Now, we're going to find these words here in 2 Samuel 22. You can also read them in the 18th Psalm. This is Psalm 18 that David's writing, but it's a psalm that should be understood in the context of military victory, that the Lord delivered him out of all his hands. So we're going to see David's going to describe how God worked with him to win, in these military capacities. Verse 29 will start. For thou art my lamp, O Lord, and the Lord will lighten my darkness. For by thee have I run through a troop. By my God have I leaped over a wall. We read about him going up against 200 of the Philistines, the bear, the lion. How did he do all that stuff? With God. As for God, his way is perfect. The word of the Lord is tried. He is a buckler to all them that trust in him. For who is God save the Lord, and who is a rock save our God? God is my strength and my power. He maketh my way perfect. He maketh my feet like hinds' feet, and setteth me upon my high places. He teaches my hands to war, so that a bow of steel is broken by mine arms. Thou hast also given me the shield of thy salvation, and thy gentleness hath made me great. Thou hast enlarged my steps under me, so that my feet did not slip. I have pursued mine enemies and destroyed them, and turned not again until I had consumed them. In the context of military victory, but David is attributing his military victory not to his own ability, but to God. Just like Joseph attributed things to God, he's attributing his ability and power to God. Now, it wasn't God that slung the stone. It wasn't God that defeated the lion and the bear. It wasn't God that circumcised 200 of the Philistines. It was David. But David was able to do that stuff because of God working in him. All of us have responsibilities. All of us have things that we do to help people, to bless people, ways that we serve. We all have abilities. And what brings those abilities to their fruition in our lives is when we walk with God and allow God to work in us and to show us what to do, to give us information and instructions so that we can do our service, use our abilities to the best of our ability to have the greatest effect for him. In the book of Ephesians, close here, show you how God intended things to work in the age of grace, the age of the one body that we live in. Verse 15 of chapter 4 in Ephesians, but speaking the truth in love may grow up into him in all things, which is the head, even Christ, from whom the whole body, fitly joined together and compacted by that which every joint supplies, according to the effectual working in the measure of every part, makes increase of the body unto the edifying of itself in love. When we read in Corinthians 12 a couple of weeks ago, we saw that we can't afford to ever disparage ourselves, and we can't afford to ever say to other members of the body, we don't need you. God needs He needs everybody, and He wants to be. What's going to make the body work together is when every member of the body is working with the effectual working in the measure of every part. If just think how the body would, Christ would work if everybody was walking by the Spirit with God. It would be an incredible thing. And that is God's intention. Now we'll see that after the gathering together. We aren't going to have any need for reproof and correction after the gathering together. But we can sure endeavor to walk in our lives that we get closer to that standard every day. So that's to profit withal, just some biblical examples. Thank you very much.